So then with Huxley's input into this stuff, am I right that they both attended peyote ceremonies at the Native American church?
They did. So Huxley did so in California, and although they maintained close contact, they weren't able to visit each other as much as they wanted to. So many of the things that they did in kind of the world of psychedelics was often done in isolation, then they would talk to each other about it. Humphry Osmond attended one here in Canada in 1956, so the same time that the word itself was coined, and he was invited to participate in a ceremony that was put on by the Native American Church of Canada, which is in part, at that time, was in part a response to the federal government's declaration that it was going to change the Indian Act, and it did change the Indian Act to prohibit certain cultural rights. And so in that moment, so in a whole different conversation about, what is an authentic expression of being culturally Indigenous, or what is an appropriate religious response to colonialization, those conversations are taking place in different corridors. And the sort of peyote ceremony comes up in between those. So in a sense, it's sort of caught in this moment of determining the value of psychedelics, as well as it's part of a conversation about, Indigenous cultural rights. And Osmond, I think much to the surprise of some of the government investigators who thought, oh, don't worry, we've got this, psychiatrist, he's going to go and straighten this all out. And Osmond goes and, sort of characteristically, as anyone who knows about him now seems totally normal, but he goes and he says, well, this is a beautiful thing. This is absolutely critical for the healing of Indigenous people. This is, their territory has been ripped away from them, and he's very empathetic. And he writes a fairly strongly worded sort of treatise, which then gets picked up by different legal teams as they are trying to make openings for peyote in Canada. And the federal government just sort of cuts him off, and they're like, that wasn't the scientist we meant to go there. But there's a clash, it seems, of both race and privilege that takes place in that moment, that today we have different vocabulary for describing that, and we maybe take it for granted that of course there's a clash there. But I think it's also an interesting sort of window into, again, that, appropriation of Indigenous knowledge and different ways of thinking about healing and spirituality in that moment.
Right. And I feel like that, would you say that there's a parallel between the kind of the rich holistic aspect of the kind of way it's used in Indigenous cultures and the broad scope of the research? Because they, and maybe Huxley's input was important here as well, but they were thinking beyond just kind of physiology and therapy to kind of theology and other areas, right?
Absolutely. And I think people like Bill Richards and, in the past, he's really focused on this and given us much more to think about in terms of where those ideas of theology and spirituality come into play. I think, or maybe it's my own lack of understanding of, the depths of spirituality and theology to give this real proper expression. But I think that Osmond and Huxley are both sort of fumbling around with this to some degree. I mean, in their letters, this comes through even more clearly than in some of the stuff that Huxley writes, which is quite polished and, articulate and thoughtful. But in their letters, as they're trying to work this out, I mean, they're sort of grasping at different edges of this and wondering, is one of the things that really resonated with me was the way that they describe one of the powerful things about, my words, sort of Indigenous approaches to plant healing or psychedelics. They said is the ways in which there is deference paid to the molecule. And they distinguish that from the ways in which we might approach aspirin. Take, for example, go to my medicine cabinet, I'll take aspirin, I won't thoughtfully prepare myself for what it might do to alleviate the pain in my head. I won't pay attention to my surroundings. But they said in preparation for a peyote ceremony, you think about what you've eaten. You know exactly how much liquid you've taken in. You cleanse yourself in some respects. You meditate. You really participate in a preparation that we don't tend to do in Western models of medicine. And they felt that that was something that was very much lost in what eventually not so much Huxley, but Osmond goes on to identify the kind of pharmaceutical wave that overwhelms our modern medicine. And he said, wait, whoa, like we've forgotten a whole, or we've sort of sidestepped a whole part of paying deference to the kinds of chemicals we put in our bodies.
Right. And it sounds like, so in this kind of Saskatchewan approach, there's this kind of appreciation of the way that context and all the things you said, intention, environment, all interact with the chemical to produce the effects, right? But is it right that at the same time there was research going on in Toronto that was based around a more reductionist or, model where they would strap people to beds and just give them the chemical and leave them alone?
Yeah, and it's fascinating because I think the Addictions Research Foundation in Toronto, I mean, of course, there are many other research units that are trying to either repeat the results or test the claims that psychedelic researchers had. And I think it's probably important to note for context that when the LSD treatments for alcoholism findings were published and other units started repeating these, they were making claims that were unheard of. They were unprecedented. 50% recoveries, 90% recoveries was, I think, the largest claim I saw. Now, doing just a little bit of digging, you discover that they got really good at determining who would be a good candidate for those kinds of experiments, and that increased their results. But needless to say, these results are also kind of mystifying to anyone engaged in non-psychedelic research who might feel upset or competitive even in this moment. Maybe that's not so bad, but what's happening at the Addictions Research Foundation in Toronto, of course, their whole orientation of their institution is to focus on addiction research. So to have these upstarts over in some place that's not Toronto, creating this was, I think there was also some sort of collegial tension or competition there. They were also very heavily invested in marijuana research at the time. So I think, at this time, there were a number of, David Healy describes this as the golden age of psychopharmacology. And he says that there are more sort of first generation psychopharmaceuticals introduced in that period than ever before or since. And if we think about that, like this is the first SSRIs, so there's a really hot period for investing in these kind of competitive strategies for both a kind of methodology, but also the substances themselves. So in that context, as RCTs are kind of coming into play, the Addictions Research Foundations as well, what's happening in Weyburn has nothing to do with the drug. These guys are doing drugs with their patients, which was true. These guys are hiring attractive nurses, my favorite concern, and they're putting them in nice rooms. These guys are used to jail cells and drunk tanks, and now you put them in a room with a couch, with a rug, and you bring them flowers and like fresh coffee. Of course they're going to say they feel better. And so to challenge that model, they strapped them to beds, they blindfolded them, they tried to sort of minimize or mitigate those external factors that they felt were producing essentially a placebo effect. And unsurprisingly, the people who came through those experiences had a terrible experience, even though some said that it wasn't terrible, but the results were really quite different. And so this, again, it challenges the substance, but it challenges the methodology, I think, even more so. And it brings forth a different kind of debate about the direction of pharmaceutical research in the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah, it seems what strikes me is that the Toronto approach seems to have an illusion that the being strapped to a bed isn't a context. It's kind of saying there's no context here; it's just the chemical. But I would say being strapped to a bed in that kind of clinical setting is its own context. And I guess what they proved, if you take them both in conjunction, is that these is the importance of setting for these compounds. I guess, right.
Exactly.
But I also wanted with Hollywood Hospital in Vancouver was another site. You mentioned Al Hubbard as well, right? Is that where he was based doing research?
I mean, I think Al Hubbard is really difficult to pin down. He pops up all over the place. He was also a pilot. He uses different names. He claims different kinds of authority and experience. So I wouldn't say he's based anywhere. But yes, he did pop up there. He sometimes frequented Hollywood Hospital. He also shows up in Weyburn a couple of times. And there is a kind of a network, I think, of investigators, some of whom would describe themselves as like-minded, and others kind of got moved to the margins throughout this period.